Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Huge episode for me. Adam Higginbotham, Challenger, A True Story of Heroism, Disaster on the Edge of Space. The Challenger Space Shuttle disaster, as most of us all know. Huge book. I loved it so much. And I was actually worried going into it because Adam's previous book, Midnight in Chernobyl, is one of my favorites of all time. Had a little bit of trepidation picking up the book. What if it's not as good as Midnight in Chernobyl? Well, I had absolutely nothing to worry about. And then getting to interview Adam was even more of a treat because get a lot more insight, especially as he went through the book, kind of the author decisions he had to make, and then how it kind of became personal for him. Absolutely love this conversation. Hope you enjoy it too. I've said enough. I'm going to shut up. Let's do it. And here we are with author Adam Higginbotham, Challenger, A True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I just want to ask, I love the book. How did you decide to write about Challenger? I did look at a previous interview where for Midnight at Chernobyl, you admitted to shamelessly going on Wikipedia and looking up anniversaries. So I don't think that's how you got Challenger, though. How'd you get here?
Yeah, that is that I did have to admit that's the lamest approach of coming up with magazine feature ideas and certainly book ideas I can possibly think of. It was slightly more organic than that because I was fascinated with the space program when I was a kid, and I'm now 55. So I was 12 when the first space shuttle launched. So that was my part of NASA's space program, really. That was, that kind of hit me at exactly the right moment. But when I was promoting the Chernobyl book, I would be interviewed, and quite often I'd be asked if I remembered where I was when I heard the news about the explosion. And I'd have to admit that I had no idea. But what I did remember very clearly was where I was and how I heard about Challenger disaster, which had happened almost exactly 3 months earlier. So that was something that kind of put it back in my mind when I was still dealing with Midnight in Chernobyl. So then when it came time to think about what to write the next book about, it was on my mind. And then when I began to look into it, I realized that there was a lot that I didn't know about what had happened. And that, the way the story is remembered, to the extent it's remembered at all now, it's the story of Christa Mcauliffe, the teacher in space. So as I began to dig into it, I determined a few things. One was that what I really wanted to do was to be able to tell the story of Mcauliffe, but also the other 6 members of the crew who were relatively little known and little remembered. And the more I found out about them, the more I realized that they all had these kind of extraordinary stories that hadn't really been told. I mean, the last time anyone really tried to do this was in 1987. And the other aspect of it was that so much material had emerged in various different forms, in the almost 40 years since it happened, that there was the opportunity to tell the kind of whole story. And most importantly, to include the experience of the handful of rocket engineers who had tried to stop the launch happening at the last moment and in the months leading up to the launch. It had all of the elements, to me, of a really worthwhile historical story that would have, that historic value, and it would bring aspects of the story to an audience who, many of whom weren't even alive when the accident happened. But it was also a kind of gripping narrative.
Did you run into a lot of roadblocks like you did for Midnight at Chernobyl? Because obviously for Midnight at Chernobyl, you were dealing with Soviet Russia asking questions that, we don't necessarily have answers to even today. But Challenger was a big black eye in a lot of ways for a lot of NASA leadership and things like that. Was your research just as complicated for this one, or was it much more straightforward and people willing to talk to you?
It was sort of similar, because what happened with writing Midnight in Chernobyl was that I found that people were, by and large, I mean, although you can't really generalize, by and large, they're happy to talk to me because they felt that their stories had been forgotten or never told in the first place. So a lot of people were kind of grateful that someone had come to them and wanted to tell their stories, and not just the stories of, the worst day of many of their lives, but to find out about how they'd arrived at that point, where they came from, what their hopes and aspirations were, and what happened to them afterwards, to tell their lives in context. There is certainly that kind of, at NASA, there is obviously a sort of institutional sensitivity about this catastrophe. But once I, explained, and having the Chernobyl book to show people was actually quite helpful in this respect. Once I could show people what I wanted to do, I think that they saw the value in that, and they realized that this wasn't, some kind of ghoulish or exploitative effort that I was engaged in, but a serious history book that wanted to tell this story in its full context. And part of that context is to show, something that I didn't really realize until I started digging into it, which is how amazing the space shuttle was as a piece of engineering in the first place. The whole program really is overshadowed by these two accidents, by Challenger and then much later the Columbia accident. And those are the things that those are the only two things that people know about the program. But it was this kind of extraordinary piece of engineering that was so ahead of its time that there were still, according to the plans they had in early 2003, it would still be flying today. I mean, that's how kind of sophisticated it was.
And the book, and I kind of brought this up right before we hit record, you're going to learn Challenger, right? That's what the book is about. But for me, as I'm reading it too, is you take everyone step by step from how did you get from the space mission and all of these amazing things in technology to this disaster happening. Because when I was finished with it, I didn't say, now I know how the Challenger happened. The question I was left with, how did something like the Challenger not happen sooner? Because it seemed like there was these amazing feats of engineering, but a lot of risk underneath all of that.
Right, that's true. The truth is that something like Challenger had happened before, because spaceflight is an extremely risky undertaking. And, they had this major disaster in 1967 with the Apollo 1 launchpad fire when 3 astronauts were killed on the launchpad at Cape Canaveral. But this really gets at kind of one of the elements of the story that I found most interesting, and has not really been kind of considered this way before, but kind of part of the original sin of NASA is that there's this dichotomy between the fact that the engineers and the astronauts at NASA are only too well aware of how dangerous spaceflight is. But at the same time, as an agency which requires for its continued existence to get money from Congress, its leadership has always perceived that what it requires is extraordinary public support and engagement. And in order to get that public support and engagement, they convinced themselves that they couldn't really be completely honest about how dangerous it was to fly people into space. And the great example of this is that before the Apollo missions, the manned Apollo missions were launched, the NASA leadership commissioned a statistical analysis from General Electric of what the chances would be of safely sending men to the surface of the moon, landing them there, and then returning them back to Earth. And GE came back and they said that the chances of successfully doing that were less than 5%. Now, when the then administrator of NASA learned the statistic, he read it and then quietly had all of that information buried, because he realized that if they went public with this information, then people would just not have any tolerance for any enterprise that had this level of risk and that low level of potential success. And then historically, as a result of that study, after that, NASA didn't really bother with those sorts of statistical studies thereafter, because their subsequent experience bore out that obviously they sent several missions very successfully to the moon. And this less than 5% figure didn't seem borne out by experience. So they kind of institutionally felt that they could disregard those sorts of studies. But the truth is that, those Apollo missions, they got very lucky with them. And the one that was nearly a catastrophe, Apollo 13, instead of becoming recognized as a near disaster, became lauded as this triumph of heroism and engineering, as they brought these 3 men successfully back from deep space after this massive explosion crippled their spacecraft. It contributed to, NASA's own mythos of the fact that they can constantly achieve the almost impossible. As time went by and the shuttle program developed, that conviction that they could do anything they wanted began to seed a level of hubris that I think ultimately led to what happened to Challenger.
And while you want to look at this and just say, well, NASA should have known better, they also were, to their defense, their funding starts to become less and less. They have to do, the same things that they were doing, whereas funding was not what it was previously. But it seems like the dirty phrase you have in this is staying on schedule. That they had to stay on schedule. They had to keep doing these things and kind of doing more with less as time went on, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But I don't think that the fact that they had to, for budgetary reasons, they got themselves into this situation where they'd been given less than half the money they initially estimated it would cost them to build the space shuttle. I think they asked for $14.5 billion in 1972. And they were given 5. So, I mean, that you're already starting in a situation where it's essentially impossible to do what you've been asked to do. And the way they managed to balance the books was that they said that they would spread this $5 billion cost over so many flights that the shuttle would ultimately pay for itself. They fly so frequently that the kind of per flight cost would drop dramatically almost as soon as it started flying. So this is where they get into this bind where they forecast in the early 70s that they're going to be flying, they're going to be making a shuttle flight at least once a week, possibly twice a week. So they're going to have this fleet of shuttles and they're going to be cycling into orbit, just like American Airlines does with an airliner. And they'd be going up, they'd be coming back, and a group of technicians would give it a quick once over, a quick wipe of the windshield, and it will be back on the launch pad to do it again. But, back then they were imagining that they were going to have 12 of these things. They're going to have 12 shuttle orbiters. And they ended up with 4. So, between the cost cutting at the beginning and the ultimate results of this, then they're kind of in a really difficult situation. But that is not to say that, that they were cavalier about safety. This is an incredibly complex undertaking, and they determined very early on that this is going to be the most complicated machine ever built. And that's what it turned out to be. They knew that they had to, maintain the same sorts of safety standards for flying manned missions that they had before, but they weren't always looking in the right places. What became clear as I got further into the story and talked to more rocket engineers and more astronauts was that they were preoccupied with the risks and the dangers that they went over at these flight readiness reviews that they would have before every flight. But they were convinced that the most complex and demanding engineering in the shuttle system were the space shuttle main engines, these 3 engines that were clustered in the tail of the orbiter, that were so overpowered and so complex that they thought that if there was going to be a catastrophe, they were going to be the cause. And that's actually something that carried through even among people who watched the accident in 1986 happen in front of them. Chris Kraft, who was the director of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, came out of mission control and remarked to another engineer as he was passing him in the hall. He said, "It was those high-pressure fuel turbo pumps. I knew it," referring to the main engines. And a lot of people watching, didn't know that it was the solid rocket boosters that had been responsible for the accident until some time afterward.
Well, and I think you laid out very well that it wasn't a rash decision that day to send the shuttle up. It was this creeping shift of risk that, oh, well, this was okay, and oh, this didn't work great, but then it was still fine. And it seemed like it was creeping risk that finally caught up to them, just sheer numbers and kind of creeping risk as opposed to one really bad decision that day.
Right, that's exactly right. It's what the sociologist Diane Vaughan, who wrote this massive book that is just called The Challenger Launch Decision, which analyzes why that part of it happened. She calls that the normalization of deviance, which is where essentially you just get comfortable with an expanding level of risk over a long period of time. And so it's not as if you're being reckless in the moment. It would take an outsider to come in and say, wait a minute, don't you see what's going on here? Over the last 2 years, you've gradually accepted more and more dangerous deviations from what you initially regarded as your engineering standards. And now you're in the situation where you're obviously doing something that's dangerous. I mean, they certainly were reckless ultimately, but they weren't being consciously reckless. It's understandable. So although there are clear villains who emerge from that part of the story, I think that it's important not to, dwell too much in having 20/20 hindsight about something like that. It's more, in the moment, it was much more complicated than that.
I do want to put a fine point on this. Before Challenger and before we jumped into the crew and everything like that, there was a lot of near misses that the public never knew about, where somebody flips a switch at the right second. How many near misses do we even think happened, even between Apollo 13 and then Challenger? How many near misses does it seem like there was where something a millimeter one way or the other and we would have lost a whole nother crew?
I couldn't put a number on the number of near misses. I mean, I didn't go into that. I mean, I'll tell you what there is is there is a NASA document called the Anomalies list, which is a very comprehensive and extremely thick document that charts every single equipment failure in the shuttle program, launch by launch. And that makes quite chilling reading, because it is like, everything from O-rings on the solid rocket boosters becoming eroded by hot gas to a failure of the pyrotechnics in the hold down bolts on the launch pad. So the way that the shuttle is attached, or an Apollo Saturn V rocket or anything is attached to the launch pad, is with these hold down bolts, which are physical bolts which have explosive charges in them, which at the moment of launch explode, parting the bolt, so that then the rocket that is being held down by the fact that it is physically bolted to the launch pad can leave the launch pad. Now, on at least one shuttle mission, the pyrotechnics in the hold down bolts attaching the solid rockets to the launch pad failed to explode. What happened was the solid rockets just exerted so much force leaving the launch pad that it just tore these hold down bolts out of their mounting.
I want to take a step out for a second because I think it's really important to point out, and I don't know how you do it, I can't explain it, but in Chernobyl and in this one, science, you lose me really, really fast in science books. Like I can go so far and then I'm like, now you're writing Chinese. You seem to have the ability to know, here is what you need to know, I'm going to explain it, and then, hey, let's move on with the story. Is that something, do you have like 10 pages and somebody comes and says less science? Or can you just see it as an author and say, this is what you need to know, and then we'll just kind of keep moving? Because you seem to have a sixth sense for it.
I'm pleased to hear that. I mean, the real answer, Brendan, is that I am writing the kinds of books that I like to read. And I find a lot of science fascinating, but I'm only interested in, as what you've described, which is the absolute minimum of science that's necessary for you to understand any given part of the story at any given time. With Midnight in Chernobyl, it was, do you have to understand everything about how a nuclear reactor works? No, you don't. But what you do need to understand, if you're really going to appreciate the kind of the tension and the drama of the story, I think, you need to understand how an RBMK nuclear reactor can overheat and the way in which it was badly designed that made it potentially dangerous. In the same way, with the Challenger story, you need to understand not how, advanced rocketry works, but you need to understand how the joints in the solid rocket boosters were put together and why they were badly designed and how they were vulnerable to failure. And once you've understood those things, which are, markedly less complicated than nuclear fission, then it means that when you get to the eve of launch, you understand in the way that some of the rocket engineers understood exactly how dangerous this is. And if you're like me, you become quite concerned about the safety of the people involved. And it makes for a dramatic and emotional moment in the story. So, I mean, that's really the answer, is I just try to keep those things to a minimum. But the wider answer is that I can't explain to a reader in those simple enough terms what's going on unless I understand it completely myself. So that, for me, is the tricky part, because it means that I then have to go find out because I am not a scientist or an engineer. Indeed, my high school physics teacher would be absolutely aghast to learn that I wrote a book about nuclear fission. With the Challenger book, I spent a lot of time talking to and emailing with a pair of Morton Thiokol rocket engineers who helped me enormously in understanding the engineering of those rockets and how they worked. And only once I got through all of that information so that I could understand it, then I could kind of sit down and write a simplified version for the book.
The other huge piece here is the teacher in space, as you mentioned, Christa Mcauliffe, who is remembered, when we talk about this, that's the name that pops up, often to the detriment of remembering the other crew members. Just from your perspective, that entire program, putting a teacher in space, it was kind of genius as far as putting eyes on the space program, but then it turns into a nightmare, right? Like, because of how it turns out, we think that was so dumb to do that. But at the time, I was very young, but I remember, I was probably only 4 or 5. I remember this. I remember that this got eyes on NASA when they said, we're putting, quote unquote, a normal person into space that isn't a politician who forced their way onto the space shuttle.
Right.
When you look back at this, is that what you saw, that this was on paper was a genius idea, but that it was a huge risk at the same time and they didn't realize it?
Well, I mean, this goes back to that dichotomy we were talking about earlier, which is that NASA was sort of misrepresenting to the public how dangerous what they were doing was. And there's a specific point in the space shuttle program at which this happens, which is that they have 4 test flights at the beginning of the program. They launch 4 times. And then once those 4 flights have been accomplished safely, they announce that the space shuttle program is operational. Now, this is a term that's usually used for like airliners, for example, when they've taken hundreds of test flights, then they'll declare, the Boeing 737 MAX operational, and then it can just fly as many times as you like without any further testing. So this was misleading because nobody who worked as an engineer at NASA or an astronaut believed for a second that the space shuttle was operational in the same way as an airliner would be after it had made 4 test flights. This goes more to the sort of the public relations aspect of NASA's approach, which was that they were deliberately trying to sell the public on the idea that spaceflight had become a routine enterprise. And so once they had accomplished this goal of convincing people that spaceflight was routine and the space shuttle was a lot like an airline, then it was a logical next step to say, well, now we do this, we do it in a shirt sleeve environment. You don't really need any special training. Once we've instructed you in how to use the toilet and how to get in and out of the emergency exit, then that's pretty much it. You don't need any special training to be a passenger on an airliner, and this is just going to be like that. And that's the approach they took with the spaceflight participant program. Because remember that Christa Mcauliffe, the teacher in space, was going to be the first of the spaceflight participants. But then within the year of that flight on Challenger, had it been successful, they were going to fly a journalist. And then next up was going to be an artist. And then there was going to be, poets or policemen or midwives or whoever they nominated to go forward and be a kind of civilian eye on spaceflight. So it started with a teacher in space, but they intended to expand this very rapidly to encompass lots of different people. But the reality was, yes, it was a very dangerous undertaking. And Christa Mcauliffe and her backup, Barbara Morgan, who was a teacher from Idaho, they knew how dangerous it was. Because I spoke to Barbara and I asked her this question, and she was very clear about the fact that Dick Scobie, the commander of the flight, had told them repeatedly that it was very risky. And one of the sort of most telling things he said to them was that this is very complicated. There's millions of things that can go wrong, but the one that's most likely to lead us astray is the human element, which ultimately proved to be the case.
And that's a question for me, as we've talked about. They knew how dangerous it was. Did they know how dangerous it was that day? Is kind of a bigger question that encapsulates everything about Challenger, which is, yes, there were those known risks, but that day, because of how cold it was, because of how everything was happening with the O-rings, did these astronauts know how dangerous it was going to be that day?
No, they didn't, because the truth is that although they knew that the shuttle itself was an extremely risky system and that spaceflight is a very dangerous enterprise, they had not been specifically informed about the dangers of the solid rockets and the joints in the solid rockets. In the aftermath of the accident, once the investigation began, the surviving astronauts began to find out about the history of these solid rocket boosters and how dangerous they'd been known to be for a long time. And they were furious. And but they weren't furious because they thought that the space shuttle was, an extremely safe spacecraft. They were furious because other people had known about a specific risk that they had not informed them of. And the truth is that many of them have said in the years since, or some of them have said in the years since, that even had they known about the risk of the solid rocket boosters, they would still have opted to have flown because they knew that it was a risky enterprise and that's part of the job. And they wanted to fly into space. They were angry about the fact that they were not fully apprised of the nature of the risks. And so that was the problem, not the fact that they thought that it was safe and they found out afterwards that it was risky. It was just, we know we're taking risks. Tell us what they are. And that's what they were angry about.
Does it get in your head as a writer? You have scenes in here right before the launch. And because we already know what's going to happen, it reminds me of reading books about Anne Boleyn in the tower the night before she's executed, because you know what's going to happen. Is it hard for you as a writer to write about all of these people and get all of this information and start putting that in there, kind of knowing what's going to happen to them and being a chronicler of their hopes, their fears, all of these things right before they get torn from their families?
I did find that, actually. I did find that difficult in this book, and this book specifically. And it affected me a lot more profoundly than writing about very similar incidents in a very similar timeline in Midnight in Chernobyl. And I think that might be just because I had experienced this much more personally than I did the Chernobyl accident. Although, I spent just as much time with the people concerned when I was reporting Midnight in Chernobyl as I did with the people involved in the Challenger story. There was something about it that I found quite hard to write. And very specifically, I spent quite a lot of time talking to Jane Smith Walcott and Alison Belcher, who are the widow and the elder daughter of Mike Smith, the pilot of the mission. And as a result of talking to them and the information that they shared with me about him and their lives with him, I really felt that I'd got to know him very well by the time I sat down to write that part of the book. And I realized afterwards that as a result of that, I spent quite a lot of time putting off writing about the accident itself, just because, I had begun to feel quite close to these people I got to know quite well, and I didn't want to have to write about them dying. Yes, is the answer to your question. I did find that quite difficult.
At the same time, it's got to be enraging when you read about some of these decisions, because like you said, there's accidents and then there's things that happen because of choices, and there are villains to the story. Are you just as emotional when you see in black and white decisions that were made that led to these people being killed? Are you also having that emotional reaction?
Not in quite the same way, because it didn't make me angry. I found some of it sort of unbelievable, because one of the major villains to emerge from the story is this rocket engineer and manager of the solid rocket booster program at the Marshall Space Flight Center, which was NASA's center for all rocketry. They oversaw the manufacture and design of the rocket boosters. Certainly, by all accounts, Malloy is someone who was this kind of garrulous, collegiate, fun-loving, good old boy. But in his behavior in these flight readiness review meetings and the teleconference before the launch, when rocket engineers from the booster manufacturer, Morton Thiokol, are trying to have the launch stopped, and in his comments after the accident, he just makes himself seem like a total monster. He lacks self-awareness, apparently humanity. He seems callous and displays a kind of disregard for the results of his actions and his decision-making that are kind of absolutely impossible to believe. And that's what I found, is that I would talk to people about Malloy, I would read his own testimony, I'd read interviews with him, and I just couldn't fathom what kind of person this was who was saying these things and attempting to justify his own behavior. So it didn't make me angry. I struggled to comprehend the way he behaved. And on the other side, when, there's one of the ways that I was able to reconstruct in such detail this fateful meeting the night before the launch, when the Thiokol engineers are saying, it's too dangerous to launch, we must stop the launch. And the NASA engineers are pushing back and saying, we don't think your data is conclusive, we think you need to go away and think about this. The way that I was able to do that is because the investigators of the Rogers Commission, who conducted the investigation for the government in the aftermath of the accident, the investigators interviewed all 34 men who were in this meeting from 3 different locations in great detail. In the interview transcripts, you've got this extraordinary sort of Rashomon-like view of what happened from all of these different perspectives, in which they recall exactly what people said, exactly the way they behaved. Were they sweating? Were they looking around them in desperation? Did they seem determined to press on? And in those transcripts, it becomes apparent that the decision to launch Challenger came down to a single person in one meeting the night before the accident happened. This rocket engineer, the head of engineering at Morton Thiokol's Wasatch division, who is the final one of 4 management votes. All 3 votes before him have gone for, yes, we'll change our minds and say it's okay to launch. And it's clear from the way that he behaves in the meeting that he knows how dangerous this is. He absolutely does not want to give the go-ahead to launch, and then feels under such pressure and is kind of so weak-willed that eventually he just bows to the pressure and throws up his hands and says, okay, let's fire. Again, when I was reading the different accounts of this happening, I could not believe it, that it just came down to this one guy with still another 12 hours to go before the launch took place. And it's already too late when this guy says, okay, let's fire.
And I know I forgot this. The launch was scrubbed multiple times, which means it wasn't, this was the one they launched, they didn't realize it. They also kind of had a few different instances to really look and do this, because it wasn't the original launch day when this finally happened. There was a few different things going on, and it seems like there even might have been other reasons not to launch that day, just from ice and everything else. It feels, once you see it all on paper, it feels completely reckless. Even though, as you point out in the book, it's this little thing here, it's this little thing here, and then you have this monument to what the hell at the end of it.
Right. There was extraordinary pressure on NASA to launch Challenger, not least because this was the beginning of 1986. 1986 was scheduled to be the busiest year in NASA history. In the 12 months of 1986, they were scheduled to get 15 flights off the ground. So they'd never done that before. But the first launch of Columbia at the beginning of January was eventually delayed 7 times, which was a NASA record. And they were just taken to the woodshed in the media for this. They're just humiliated constantly on the nightly news over one delay after another. And then there were another series of delays with Challenger, which were heaping on top of the way they'd been treated on the 6 o'clock news over Columbia, just put more and more pressure on them. So the first time they were delayed, they'd hoped to launch on Super Bowl Sunday, and Vice President Bush was on his way down to watch it launch. And then they got a weather forecast on Saturday evening that convinced them that the weather was going to be terrible, and they couldn't launch. And then, of course, the sun comes up at Cape Canaveral on Sunday morning, and it's a beautiful day. It would have been perfect to launch. So they looked like fools for that. And then the launch is postponed until Monday, and then the crew go out to the pad, they get strapped in, they sit there for hours, clock's ticking down, everything's fine. And then at the last minute, they close the hatch and they have to remove this handle from the crew entry hatch, and a bolt gets stuck. And this just turns into this kind of ridiculous sort of Inspector Clouseau style farce, which is filmed from cameras on the launch pad, where ultimately these guys have to use a hacksaw to cut this thing off the crew entry hatch. And then they've got like half an hour of the launch window left, and then the wind gets too strong and they have to scrub the whole thing. So once again, 6 o'clock news, what a joke. NASA can't get this thing off the ground. It's too much of a challenge to get a Challenger off it. All of this kind of stuff. So they're humiliated over and over again. And then, on once that launch is scrubbed, then they reschedule for Tuesday, except that the weather forecast for Tuesday is for extremely cold overnight weather. And the temperature is going to plunge to record lows for Florida. And everything else except the weather forecast looks perfect. It's going to be a clear day, not high winds, none of the other problems. And when Morton Thiokol gets to learn of the cold temperatures, then the engineers there say, well, actually, this is probably going to be a problem, which is why they convene this teleconference and they say the solid rockets are going to be dangerous if you launch them in these conditions. We say no. NASA kind of bullies them into changing their minds. But then the next morning, as you say, the launch structure out of the launch pad is covered in ice. One of the engineers describes it as looking like something out of Dr. Zhivago. And so they have this group of engineers from Rockwell International, which is the contractor that built the orbiter, and they say, we can't guarantee it's safe to launch. We're essentially saying, don't launch. But then they too are overridden. There are other limitations on the shuttle system that emerge because of the cold weather, because of high winds out at sea. There's several, as you say, reasons why the launch could be scrubbed, but each one of them is kind of battered aside by the launch managers, and eventually they decide to go.
Something you have in the book that I don't know how many people know this. It wasn't necessarily covered up, but it feels like it just wasn't talked about a lot, is we find out later everything goes wrong, we know what happens, but for years, up until recently, reading this book and some other things I read, thought that the entire crew was immediately killed in the explosion. And that's just not what happened, is it?
Yeah, that's almost certainly not what happened, no. That is the case, because the way the story was reported initially and the way NASA officials allowed people to think about the accident was that there was a catastrophic explosion that made the entire shuttle and the solid rockets in the external tank, the whole thing just disintegrated in a massive fireball, and everybody aboard was instantly killed. But that is not what happened. What happened is that the crew compartment, which was a separate pressurized capsule contained within the fuselage of the Space Shuttle orbiter, escaped from the explosion intact, and indeed continued flying upwards on the trajectory of the shuttle until it reached its apogee and then started falling back towards the Earth. And it fell back towards the Earth intact and was only destroyed when it hit the surface of the Atlantic a little more than 2 minutes later.
We know this because there was actually systems on there where, specifically a life support system that was flicked on by somebody, proving that somebody was at least conscious after this all happened to switch on one of the other crewmates' life support system. I mean, so it's not even really conjecture. There is scientific proof that somebody was at least still alive when this all happened.
Yes, there's definitely engineering evidence from the investigation that suggests that one of these pieces of breathing apparatus was turned on by someone after the explosion took place. We can't say for sure whether or not all of the crew were conscious after the disintegration of the spacecraft, but it seems that at least one person probably was.
And now you mentioned the Rogers Commission, which investigated all of this after the disaster. How close was that to becoming a whitewash? It seems like a lot of things came out of it that maybe it was going to kind of cover up for NASA, but it ended up not so much. How close was it to being just kind of a full cover up where it's like, oh, these things happened. Sorry about that. Move on with your day.
I don't think that was ever going to be the case. One of the reasons that the Rogers Commission was created in the first place was because the initial investigation was conducted internally by NASA itself, which is exactly what had happened after the Apollo 1 launch pad fire. That investigation was conducted internally after the then administrator of NASA had made a handshake deal with President Johnson to conduct the investigation themselves rather than having an external inquiry. Now, a similar thing started to happen with the Challenger accident, but then President Reagan's chief of staff decided that they needed to invest as much as possible in total transparency, and they couldn't have even the appearance of a cover-up, which is part of the reason that the Rogers Commission was appointed in the first place. And then in the initial days of the Rogers investigation, Rogers himself was very solicitous of the senior NASA officials and seemed inclined to take them at their word. But then newspaper reporters and radio reporters began to reveal that it wasn't quite as simple as the way the NASA officials were representing it. And at that point, the investigation turned quite aggressive. And so from the very early days, there was no question of it being any kind of cover-up. What I would say is that having spoken to people who were on the commission at the time, that what Rogers wanted to make sure happened was that the results of the investigation did not destroy NASA as an agency. He felt that NASA was too important to the safety future of the country as a whole for it to be annihilated by revelations from the inquiry. So he wanted to find out what happened. He wanted to make those results public. He wanted to make the nature of the investigation public and transparent. And he wanted to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. But he wanted to make sure that the cost of that was not the destruction of NASA itself.
With the Columbia disaster coming after this, did NASA learn nothing? Did something different go wrong between Challenger and Columbia, or was it the same old, same old?
Well, the conclusions of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board were broadly that NASA has learned nothing. They made so many of the same mistakes that they did with Challenger, with Columbia. There were lots of, structural changes made after the Challenger accident to NASA. There were lots of new institutional elements that were introduced, so that there were safety bodies that were introduced that didn't exist before Challenger, of a kind that had existed during the Apollo program, but being gradually whittled away. All of the senior decision makers involved in the decision to launch Challenger were either reassigned or left. But you've got to remember that the Challenger happened in 1986, and the space shuttle flew safely then for many, many years. And it was 2003 when Columbia was eventually lost. And a lot of what happened in between was that, there was a generational shift in the agency. A lot of people who'd been working there and had learned those lessons the hardest way imaginable with Challenger, had retired or left. And so the institutional memory of those lessons learned was not there by 2003. which was part of the reason that, it seemed that they'd learned nothing, because the people who had learned those lessons were no longer there. And that's part of the reason why eventually, in the wake of the Columbia accident, NASA created this body called the Apollo Challenger Columbia Lessons Learned Program to make sure that that institutional memory was retained.
Now, for somebody, you mentioned you loved the space program, all of this stuff. When you finish this book, do you take away from it those mistakes, or do you take more away from it all of the other things that are in this book? I mean, we focused on this is just a little part of it. The science, the amazing things that were done. What kind of sticks out to you most now that the book is done and now it's going to be out there for everybody to read?
I think that what sticks with me most is the element of this kind of history that gets me involved with it in the first place, which is the personal stories of the individuals involved. So the stories of each of the astronauts are really remarkable. The members of their families that I met, their stories are kind of extraordinary. But also those rocket engineers, people like Alan McDonald and Roger Beaujolais from Morton Thiokol, the stories of what they went through, not only to try and stop the launch taking place, but then the way that their lives were upended, and in Beaujolais' case, certainly destroyed by the fact that they turned whistleblowers as the accident investigation began. Those are the things, those stories, the things that really stick with me.
Now, Adam, there's wonderful people out there who are misguided and think that history is boring, right? They might look at this book and say, nonfiction, history, space, this is not for me. That's not going to be exciting. I'd rather read a fiction book. If I sat one of them in front of you and they said, why should I read Challenger? What would you say?
Are there really people out there like that?
There are. I met them. We've had long talks. I think I've converted almost all of them. But if there's anyone left, I want you to clean it up.
It's why I was interested in writing about it in the first place. It's an astonishing story. And it has all of the elements of a good fiction story. It has extraordinary heroism. It has some kind of remarkable blunders and hubris involved in it. And there are heroes and there are villains. I would like to think that these are protagonists who are really brought to life in kind of vivid detail, in just the way that they would be in a novel, in this history book. That's the kind of history that I like to read, which is history that isn't like boring old history of the kind that I studied when I was in high school and university. I'm always motivated by the characters in history and their idiosyncrasies and their crazy behavior, not by the great man theory of history and the, economic and social development. That's not really what motivates my interest in history. It's the story of individuals. That's what's interesting.
Well, Adam, I think it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.
And that's it for this episode. Adam, thank you so much for coming on Challenger. Everybody, this is going to be one of the best books of the year. Hands down. I will not change my mind. It's impossible. Go out and get it. Hit us up, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. In the meantime, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.